So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Milan Sorepa. I'm Director of Inclusion Europe. Very happy to welcome you all to our last webinar in what was a series of discussions and conversations about employment for people with intellectual disabilities in Europe. This last one in this series and in this year is going to bring together these conversations and highlight the experiences and views that we've collected and that we have created in here. We'll have all sorts of speakers presenting their views and then some of the work that we've done in this particular project. But of course, you also have the opportunity to contribute yourself. So please don't hesitate to write questions. There is the chat function should be on top of your screen, so you can write any questions or comments you have in there. We'll take care of those and then try to answer them all. So please do not hesitate to contribute. Of course, there will be also time for more of a discussion towards the end of the webinar. But we'll be opening with a couple of presentations and statements. Let me just also briefly introduce the project in which this has been happening. It's called My Talents for Diversity. We've been working on it for 2 years together with Plena Inclusion, FPIT, and the Untitled School of Management. And the whole point of that project was to focus on employment opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities. All of you know very well that people with intellectual disabilities find it very hard to get a job, especially on the open labor market. And that is what we wanted to focus on, how employment on open social market works, to discover different businesses and different companies that employ people with intellectual disabilities, to highlight those different kind of approaches and experiences and bring them for others to learn from them and possibly, of course, create other job opportunities. As you very well aware as well, this has become more complicated now with the pandemic, and not only that we have 2D conferences online, but there is also, of course, a clear impact on the job opportunities and number of employments, and we'll cover that as well a little bit later in the webinar. I will point you towards the Inclusion Europe website, where you can find all the materials that we produced, including research about employment, different kind of videos outlining all kinds of angles and perspectives on employing people with intellectual disabilities. We'll post the link to those directly into the chat so you can easily access it. I would recommend to do it actually after the webinar, of course, so I don't know why I'm telling you now. I don't want you to leave and watch some videos, because we are going to move to our first speaker to give you an overview of the videos and other outcomes of the My Talents for Diversity project. And that speaker is our colleague from Inclusion Europe, Barbara Marcondes. I give you the floor, Barbara.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction, Milan. I think you should see very soon a PowerPoint presentation in the screen, hopefully.
Oh, we can't, but I think you can start anyway. But...
Okay, let me try to have it done. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we
okay,
can.
Great. Let me go straight to page 2. So as Milan just mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about what were the studies that we did under the project, the events, and so on. The videos that we did, and all these documents, all these materials, they are in this process of, as just Milan mentioned, to include more people with intellectual disabilities in the open labor market. So really try to have useful, materials, very straightforward and practical, that can actually help companies and people with intellectual disabilities and families to increase their participation in the open labor market. And before I go into the outcomes, I think it's quite important to also stress that one of the main goals of the project was to connect people with intellectual disabilities and companies, and to show that it's actually not so hard to employ people with intellectual disabilities as some may think. And also to highlight that, when we talk about employing people with intellectual disabilities and what it entails. So for instance, when you think about diversity management, that are all the actions that, should be taken by both the company, the person with intellectual disabilities, their families, and so on. These things, when they are implemented, they don't actually only benefit people with intellectual disabilities, but they actually benefit everyone, other colleagues and the companies. And yeah, basically it's so what I want to say is that yes, it is about improving the conditions to make people with intellectual disabilities to be employed more, but also it's about these being beneficial to everyone. So one of the outcomes that we came up with the project was the European research and the lessons learned. The European research was done mainly by our partner in the project, Antwerp Management School, where they interviewed many companies that already employ people with intellectual disabilities, from companies from all around Europe. And they interview these companies, and they in these interviews they talk about their experience employing people with intellectual disabilities, what employees with intellectual disabilities think, what challenges they have, and so on. And the document's actually quite interesting because it not only talks about what companies are doing, but it also brings recommendations. So for instance, to think of how we can have hiring processes that are more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. So for instance, instead of having, written tests, to have actual interviews, because it's much easier for people with intellectual disabilities to express themselves in this way, or to have information in easy to read about what are the job tasks, the job responsibilities, the employees' rights, what is expected from the employers, and so on. And actually, with this research, it was quite interesting to know companies that are already employing people with intellectual disabilities. And something that is quite interesting to highlight is that there is still a lot of research that could be done when it comes to what are the companies doing to employ people with intellectual disabilities. It seems like there isn't enough, study, enough research in this area. Now I'll talk a little bit about this other document that we created. These are guidelines on diversity management to include employees with intellectual disabilities. And this document is actually very interesting because it is mainly for companies. So it lays down key concepts of what companies can do to, you know, to become more inclusive. So for instance, it talks about what are reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations are, in a very simple way, changes that are done by the employers to make sure that all the employees have equal working conditions. It also talks about the importance of having support. And it's quite important to stress that when we think of support, there are mainly two kinds of support. A support that is external. So for instance, a person with intellectual disability starts working in a company, and to get to know what are the tasks and so on, this person have a job coach that doesn't work for this company. The job coach is gonna, you know, explain and help the employee with intellectual disabilities to get used to their job tasks, to get to know their colleagues and so on. And then after a while, when the person is confident, you know, don't feel like they want the support of the job coach leaves, and the person just perform their tasks by themselves. And there is also what we call internal support. Internal support is basically someone that work in the company, and they're gonna somehow be the focal person, the focal point for the employee with intellectual disability. So for instance, if they have questions, if they're struggling with something, if they would like to change something, they're always going to talk to that colleague, and they know that you're going to have the help they need. And the guidelines also talk about something that it's extremely relevant, yet not very mentioned when we think about of employment of people with intellectual disabilities, that it's the role of the families. So to say how important it is that the families are to some extent in this also process, because in many cases, it's usually, you know, a family member that may help the person getting to work, doing their daily routines. So to carry out all the paperwork and so on, and how companies should also take that into account to have this broader understanding when they are employing people with intellectual disabilities. Then we also did some quite hands-on videos. They are extremely interesting because they basically show different topics when it comes to inclusive employment. The videos have subtitles in many languages. They are all available in our YouTube channel, so after the event you can check them all out. And the videos are gonna show experiences of employees with intellectual disabilities talking about, for example, reasonable accommodation, or the support that they receive from their colleagues, or the support they receive from a job coaching. Finally, the last point that I wanted to highlight about the event, or about the project, sorry, are the events that we had. And I say that because we had many different events, and events that brought together different groups talking about employment. So, for instance, I think there was a comment. Yes, I can definitely speak a little bit slower. I'm really sorry. So when we think of the events that the project had, there were events that were more focused on the European level. So in these events, we reached out to, you know,
Było sporo wydarzeń związanych z tym projektem i
we reached out to policymakers at the EU level, and, you know, wanted to talk to them. So what can we expect to improve when it comes to the laws and the policies, to make sure that people with intellectual disability will have the right to work respected. We also brought people from disability organizations and self-advocates to talk about, to think together what can be done. On a different level, we also wanted to show what organizations have been doing when it comes to supporting people with intellectual disabilities to get a job in the open labor market. So we showed examples from different countries in Europe, from Czechia, from Denmark, showing what organizations are doing to support people with intellectual disabilities, all this process of talking to the person and talking to the company and accommodating the job tasks to the abilities of the job seeker and so on. And we also reached to companies because we wanted to know to show examples of companies that are employing people with intellectual disabilities and also show what they are doing. So for instance, we had very recently an event that highlighted how companies are actively trying to come up with employment opportunities for people with disabilities. By this I mean the IKEA group, for example. They have been in different countries trying to really engage in how they can employ more people with disabilities. So I think these were the points that I wanted to highlight from the project. As I said, all these events, all this content is available in our website, and I think you can check it in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think I will destroy the carefully prepared agenda that my colleagues sent me, and I will give you participants the possibility to come in with any comments or speeches. There was quite a bit of stuff that Barbara presented, the various reports and methodologies and tools. And I wonder if you have already some thoughts about how you might use this or your own experiences. So if anybody is interested in coming in at this point and contributed to this conversation and share with us what are your thoughts about what Barbara just presented, I will give you now the opportunity. So you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself and take the floor directly.
Albino, você quer falar alguma coisa? O Milan perguntou se os participantes...
Enganei-me, desculpe.
Imagina. So it was just a mistake, Milan.
Yeah, no problem. Well, okay. I guess since it appears we don't have that, I guess we'll try that in a couple of minutes again and give you the opportunity to share your views and opinions on the issue. But let's move on to another item on the agenda, and let's bring in our colleague from Inclusion Europe, Soufiane, who will first of all introduce himself and then share with you his experiences and views on employment. Soufiane.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Soufiane Lamrani. I'm the easy-to-read editor at Inclusion Europe. I started working...
I'm sorry, Soufiane, perhaps also try to be a little bit slower.
Okay, yeah.
There are people translating, so we have to accommodate.
Okay. I started working in 2008 at Inclusion Europe. This was not my first job, since I had worked in a telephone company as a sales rep before. But I'm happy working at Inclusion Europe, and I really enjoy what I do. Back when I started the job, I had some trouble when I had to work in French since it's not my first language. Translating documents from English to French was challenging, but I trained myself using the internet and now it is much easier. In my job, I have met new people, made new contacts, and I have had the opportunity to share what I know about Easy to Read. This is with our meeting. This is one thing that happened when I was, and this is another with a group at our old office in Brussels. And this was part of a training in Easy to Read in Russia, where I met new people. One thing I consider positive is that I feel very supported by my team. They give me backup and understand my needs. They give me comments on my work and call me whenever I need it. I'm thankful for their support. I have a great relation with my co-workers and I'm friends with many of them. Employment is very important. Thanks to my job, I have become more independent. I live on my own and I have money to buy food, movies, and games. It makes me feel respected as a member of the community. And to the employers, I ask you to listen to the person and make the workplace accessible. For example, wheelchair users may need to take a taxi to work, so the company should cover the cost. And my advice that I give to people with intellectual disabilities struggling to find a job is don't give up. There's an old saying, and the saying goes, try and try again. Reach NGOs for support and send us. And don't be scared to put yourself out there.
Okay, thank you, Sufyan. Always good to hear that you like working for Inclusion Europe. Like I give you good marks for your presentation of your work at Inclusion Europe. I really appreciate it. To be clear, this is the first time I heard a presentation. I didn't force Sufyan to say those things. Okay, and let's bring in Inclusion Europe Vice President, Chair of the European Platform of Self-Advocacy and Co-Chair of the Hungarian Association EFRES, László Bercse. László?
Thank you very much, Milan. Hello, my name is László Bercse, Vice President Inclusion Europe and EPSO President, co-president with.
Sorry, can you see my screen now with László's presentation?
No, I cannot see it. No.
You cannot. Okay. Sorry, just bocsánat, csak egy pár perc. I just try to share the screen. Then we can proceed. Now, can you see it?
No, still nothing.
Sorry?
No, I cannot.
No, okay. Sorry, can I ask Barbara to share the presentation, maybe your...
Now I see a presentation. I think it is from you, Tibor. Not again.
Okay. I just stopped it at the minute it started to work. So could you please, Barbara, share it?
Yes, my colleague Gerlinde is gonna share it. in a moment.
Yeah, I'm also encountering some technical issues, but I'm trying my best.
Yeah, I think let's if we can let's start and go on, Laszlo, and if the presentation kicks in, we can catch up. But let's move on. Okay.
Az évfolyamán 2012-ben kezdtem el dolgozni, irodai asszisztensként. Nagyon örültem annak, hogy el tudtam helyezkedni. Ez nem volt könnyű, volt olyan munkahely, ahová szintén irodai asszisztensnek akartam jelentkezni, de amit megtudták, hogy értelmi fogyatékosságú ember vagyok, be is tették a telefont.
I started working at AFOS in 2012 as an office assistant. I was very happy that I could find a job. It was not easy at all. There was a workplace where I wanted to apply, also for an office assistant position, but they hung up the phone as soon as I told them that I was a person with intellectual disability.
Örülök, hogy az évfolyam hasznos munkát tudok végezni. Mások is értékelik és megbecsülik a munkámat. Azóta irodai asszisztensből társelnöki pozícióig küzdöttem fel magam. Képviselem a szervezetet hazai és nemzetközi szinten. Egyetemi órákat tartok, és fontos eseményeken beszélek. Mindig izgalmas feladataim vannak, és fizetést is kapok a munkámért.
I am glad that my work at AFOS is useful. What I do is valued and respected. I worked my way up from being an office assistant and became co-chair of the organization. I represent the organization on national and international level. I teach some classes at universities and speak at important events. I always have interesting tasks and I get paid for my work.
2017-ben pedig leválasztottak az EPSA vezetésébe. Tibor a munkatársam, aki támogat a munkámban.
In 2017, I got elected to the EPSA steering group. Tibor is my colleague, he supports me in my work.
4 éve kezdtünk el együtt dolgozni, amikor megválasztottak az évfolyam társelnökének. Tiborral nagyon jól tudok együtt dolgozni. Megbeszéljük a feladataimat, és nemzetközi konferenciákon tolmácsol nekem. Emellett nagyon jól szoktam magam érezni, amikor mondjuk Brüsszelben túl vagyunk egy munkanapon, és megnézzünk egy jó horrorfilmet.
We started working together 4 years ago when I got elected as co-chair of AFOS. We can work together really well. We always discuss my tasks, and he translates for me at international events. We also have a good time when we travel to Brussels, for example, and watch horror movies after work.
Számomra nagyon nagy kihívás, és egy pozitív élmény volt, amikor 18 nyarán meghívott az Európai Bizottság Brüsszelbe, hogy beszéljek a kiváltásról.
It was a great challenge for me, and a positive experience too, when I got invited to Brussels by the European Committee in 2018 to speak about deinstitutionalization.
Illetve idén december 2-án, amikor a fogyatékossággal élő személyek Európai Parlamenti napján szólaltam fel. Arról beszéltem, milyen hatással van a koronavírus járvány az önérvényesítők és családjaik életére. Szerencsére ezekre az eseményekre nagyon jól ment a felkészülés. Milán segített nekem megtervezni a beszédeket, Tibor pedig segített a fordításban.
It was also exciting that this year I spoke at the European Day of Persons with Disabilities. I spoke about how the coronavirus pandemic affects the lives of self-advocates and their families. Fortunately, preparing for these events went really well. Milan supported me to plan my speech, and Tibor helped me with the translation.
Én ezt tudnám javasolni azoknak, akik munkát keresnek, Tudom, hogy nehéz, de ne adják fel a keresést. Ha rátalálnak arra a munkára, amit nagyon szeretnének csinálni, akkor felejthetetlen élményben lesz részük. Nagyon jó érzés lesz számukra, hogy hasznos munkát végezhetnek. Thank you very much.
For those who are looking for employment, I would recommend the following. I know it is difficult, but don't give up. If you find a job what you like, it will be an unforgettable experience. It feels very good to do something important. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Laszlo. It was very interesting about just want to highlight one element of what you said, as the teaching at the universities and then possibly other contexts. I think it's an important element of your role and the role of other self-advocates across Europe, and it's potentially, of course, another of employment opportunities. So I think teaching about CRPD like you do, or easy to read, and other aspects is just one element of what you said I wanted to specifically highlight. And let's move on to another speaker in this segment, and he's from Portugal, works with our Portuguese member FENACERCE, and name is Albino Silva, and he will tell you about his employment and his experience with work. Albino.
Olá, Albino, tudo bem?
Sim, sim.
Então, vamos começar. Primeiro, eu vou fazer a pergunta, falar em inglês, e aí você responde e eu traduzo, pode ser? Então, primeiro você vai falar um pouco da sua experiência de vida, correto?
Ok, correto.
So, I'm translating for Albino, so the first topic that he's going to talk about is a little bit his life experience and how it then resulted in him getting a job, and then he's going to talk a little bit about his work. Então vamos lá, Albino. O que você quer falar para a gente sobre a sua trajetória?
Ok. Olha, mas sou Albino, tenho 34 anos, andei primeiro numa escola normal, onde fiz o 4º ano, até 98. Depois mudei para uma escola de ensino especial, onde estive a estudar até o 9º ano. Depois, mais tarde, fiquei 2 anos em casa à espera de uma oportunidade para ir a uma organização. Tive durante 6 meses a uma organização a tirar um curso profissional, mas era difícil porque as coisas lá eram muito difíceis de se perceber, e então vi que não era para mim e desisti.
Posso parar um pouquinho aí e daí eu traduzo para não ficar muita coisa?
Sim.
Perfeito. So, his name is Albino, he's 34 years old, and he studied both in a mainstream school and also like in an ordinary school and in a special school throughout his life. When he finished school, he started looking for job opportunities, but he couldn't find, so he was actually for around 2 years unemployed. After that, he started a course, some sort of a professional course, but it was quite challenging for him, so he unfortunately had to give up. Pode continuar.
Ok. Depois, então, tive a oportunidade de entrar na CS Lisboa, na organização da CS Lisboa, onde vi que aquilo era diferente do que uma escola, onde tive a oportunidade de não só de fazer novos amigos, mas também de fazer atividades, como natação, a piscina, a ginástica, o teatro, e depois, mais tarde, então, a primeira atividade socialmente útil, ou seja, a ASO, ou seja, o emprego, né? E fui então fazer entrevista para essa empresa, que é a tal, e depois entrei. Só que primeiro comecei a trabalhar para eles através da SESI, da organização, e depois mais tarde é que fui trabalhar para lá.
Tá, então deixa eu traduzir aqui. So after, you know, this experience that didn't really work out very well for him, he started to looking of organizations that he could engage in that would help him to find a job and so on. Because he wanted to, of course, to have the social aspects of having friends, but he was also looking for a job. So what happened was that he got engaged with our member organization in Portugal, FENACERSI, more specifically their branch in Lisbon. And there he got some sort of education. Should we start, unemployment? And they also helped him to get unemployment that he's been doing for many years, that he's going to tell us a little bit more. Pode continuar. Então, você estava falando da empresa que você trabalha,
Sim,
né?
exato. Vou terminar para lá. Eu vi muitos, pronto, conheci vários colegas, comecei a ter amizade por eles, vi alguns deles irem embora para outras empresas, mas o trabalho estava a ser feito do que eu faço no Excel, são de dados que eu tiro através do Excel, que eu vou ver num site da internet e que depois vão para os meus colegas para serem organizados para irem para as empresas, para as empreitadas, para as obras, para os jornais de todo o mundo e pronto, e foi em geral.
Só vou traduzir rapidinho.
Okay.
So now he talked a little bit about the company that he has been working. He has been working there for around 10 or 11 years. And there he has many colleagues and colleagues that also help him to tell him what he should do and give him tasks. So basically he has an office job. He works a lot with like Excel sheets and separating documents and data that is going to be analyzed. So that's basically what he does in his job. Pode continuar.
É uma empresa de tecnologias de informação que fornece essas mesmas informações para outras empresas. Depois, quando o trabalho está feito, ou seja, 3 dias por semana, das 9 às 1h30, vou a pé, de metro até a Acessi, onde aí faço as outras minhas tarefas. E depois é o retrocesso, pronto, até casa, e o dia a seguir é mais do mesmo. Atualmente dou-me bem com os meus colegas de trabalho, dou bem dos colegas da minha organização, de onde também faço parte de um grupo de altos representantes, onde falamos destes mesmos temas que falamos. E participei em alguns projetos organizados pela FENACESI, projetos esses que têm a ver com autoapresentação, autonomias, páginas de apoio e outros mais.
Perfeito. Eu só vou traduzir para não ficar muita coisa. So he was telling me that he was saying, everyone, that his job is, he works in a tech company in Lisbon, and he has, a very good relationship with his colleagues at work. And apart from this job, he also works at FENACERSI. So there he is part of a project that FENACERSI has, and he is also a self-advocate. So he's in a lot of projects that FENACERSI is developing in Portugal and so on. And he was saying that he also has a very good relationship with his colleagues at FENACERSI.
Depois desses projetos, alguns foram internacionais, onde estive em Madrid e em Bruxelas. Também alguns também tive a oportunidade de ver o lançamento de apoio em Fusion, em Madrid, e também já estive presente com alguns órgãos da EPSA, especialmente com o Milan, tive a oportunidade de conhecer lá, e outros que estão aqui presentes. E isso me reconheceu muito e é o que faz de mim o que sou hoje, e agradeço à minha organização e à FENACES.
Yes, so he was talking about some of the projects that he has already participated. He has been to different places, including Brussels, where he had the opportunity to actually meet the director, Milan, who is today's moderator. And he was saying that he really enjoys that. I wanted to have a final question for him, that it's about the COVID, and maybe he can talk briefly about how his work has been affected by the COVID. Albino, muito
sim.
obrigada. Agora eu queria te perguntar
Do COVID.
se você podia exatamente.
Ok, e assim, eu já ia.
O que.
Já ia falar disso, ok. Durante o Covid, as nossas ASUs pararam, porque assim o governo disse e porque as nossas pararam, e dentro desse processo as nossas organizações tiveram a organizar-se como podiam e como iam ver, podiam trabalhar com os autorepresentantes e connosco durante este pandemia de Covid. E, portanto, todas as ASUs estão paradas e por isso não sabemos mais nada até agora. Não sabemos quando é que vai voltar as ASU para todos, para mim e os meus colegas, e por isso é que não tenho estado em teletrabalho como outras pessoas têm estado, porque tanto o meu trabalho, a minha empresa como a minha organização, ainda não falam uma com a outra e não se sabe mais nada, e por isso ainda enquanto o governo também não der autorização que haja atividades socialmente úteis, ficarão até agora até ver em stand-by.
Perfeito. So he shared a little bit about how both of his jobs were very affected. So the organization, the tech company that he works, and also FENACERSI, they have been very affected by the COVID. So they actually had to stop all their activities, and they don't really know when it's going to go back to normal. So at the moment, he unfortunately is not being able to work. Muito obrigada, Albino. Agora a gente continua com o evento, tá bom?
Ok, obrigado.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Albino. Thank you to all you three speakers. And I would like, again, to give now the opportunity to any participant who would like to reflect or ask any questions of the three speakers we just had talk about their experiences working in all kinds of different contexts and situations. So if there is anyone who would like to pose any question or comment on that, now is your opportunity. Okay.
Sorry, László has a question.
Okay, good. László.
A mikrofont, Laci.
Okay. Én a COVID-hoz szeretnék hozzá kapcsolódni, hogy ugye nagyon sok fogyatékos embert megviselt ez a járvány, és főleg az, hogy nem lehet látni a végét, hogy teljesen ilyen depressziós időszakban érezhetik magukat, és nagyon sokan elvesztették a munkájukat.
It's just a comment about how we feel about the COVID situation. I feel sometimes depressed, and the difficulty is that we cannot see the end when it will end, and many people with intellectual disabilities lost their jobs, so it's not easy for us.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, László, and it basically serves as a good bridge to the next part of the webinar. because that is exactly about employment and how it was impacted by the crisis and possibly may be impacted in the future if also the economic repercussions that are likely to come following this. So with that, let's move on to another presentation, and I will give the floor to our colleague Rita Crespo, who will present a report that we created and will publish it right after this webinar, and it reflects exactly on how coronavirus impacted the employment opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities. Rita.
Hello, I will try to share my screen now so you can see the presentation. Is good? We see it?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. So yes, as Milan said, I will now present a report we have done between Inclusion Europe and Plena Inclusión, which is our member in Spain, about the impact of COVID on the employment of people with intellectual disabilities. So I think there is something that has become very clear during the last few months, which is that things were not great before, but they are worse now. So this is also true for employment. Employment rates of people with intellectual disabilities before the pandemic were already pretty low, but the crisis has worsened this situation. What the report wants to do is to shed light on the situation, highlight our advocacy work, and show good practices and recommendations to respond to the pandemic. The main lesson for me is that the role of our organizations in times of emergency is fundamental. People with disabilities and their organizations must be consulted in all decisions that affect them, in normal times and in emergency times. And since people with disabilities were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, they need to be included in the recovery plans. So to show some data from before the pandemic, this is data from all Europe, is an average of all Europe. In the left, we see in the blue bar is the percentage of people in employment without disabilities, and we see that is 75%. On orange on the right, we see 50% of people with disabilities are in employment in Europe. Sadly, this percentage is probably much lower for people with intellectual disabilities. We do not have data at the European level, but we have, for example, in Spain, Plena Inclusión showed that in Spain is 20% of people with intellectual disabilities in employment, which is very low. So what happens when the pandemic started? First of all, we see workshop centers closing. And since in many countries they are not considered workers legally, the protection measures were not applied to them. Others that were in the open labor market could not work due to the restrictions or because they were considered at-risk population. Plena Inclusión showed that in 6
Okay, is it just me or is the sound gone off? Sufyan?
I can hear
You're
you.
stuck.
Okay,
Hey,
but we lost
sorry.
Rita.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I live in the middle of nowhere and sometimes these things happen.
Okay, right, but you are back.
Yes, I am back.
But I
Did
guess you need to go a little bit back to in the
Yes.
presentation.
Yes. Did you hear about our advocacy work or that was cut?
I think that was cut. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here is fine.
A little bit still back. It was quite a long time because
Oh,
before.
that bad? Oh my God. Here in the, did you see the graph? No.
Yeah, I think you can start from here. Yes.
From the graph? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry about that. Hopefully it won't happen again. Okay. So, I was talking about the fact that there were fewer new contracts during the COVID crisis, and this graph shows that. This graph shows how many new contracts of people with disabilities are signed every year. As you can see, from 2013 to 2019, there is an increase, a very steady increase, that suddenly goes down in 2020 with 30% fewer new contracts in 2020. So we see that not only people are losing their jobs, but there are also fewer people entering the labor market. So to respond to this crisis, Inclusion Europe and Plena Inclusión did plenty of advocacy work. Plena Inclusión in Spain demanded better protection of people with intellectual disabilities, raised awareness about the situation, and advocated that government measures included people with intellectual disabilities. Inclusion Europe launched a petition to defend the rights of people with intellectual disabilities and their families during the emergency to the Committee of Petitions in the European Parliament, raised awareness on the situation, staying in touch with our members, and as Barbara said, we did multiple seminars on employment. So now I would like to talk to you about the response at the European Union level. This is something that you probably heard about. Should be approved soon, which is the recovery plan package. As you can see in the scheme, it consists mainly of two parts: the multi-annual financial framework, which is the long-term budget of the EU, and Next Generation EU, which is new funds that will increase the money we allocate to those long-term budget funds. In the multi-annual financial framework, I'm highlighting here 3 funds. There are many more, but first, the cohesion policy wants to reduce inequalities among regions in Europe. The European Social Fund Plus wants to increase social inclusion and improve skills and jobs. And the Rights and Values Program, I'm highlighting it because it wants to end discriminations against people with disabilities, among other things. Then the Next Generation EU will enlarge that money we are giving to those funds. The Recovery and Resilience Facility wants to respond to the pandemic and mitigate the economic effects. REACT-EU wants to give more money to the European Social Fund Plus, and RESC-EU wants people to have protective equipment, so that is also important for people with disabilities to be able to work during a pandemic, to have masks, to have tests, and all that. Then it is not in the scheme because it is not part of those programs, but it's very important to remark that there was an emergency program giving 100 billion euros in loans, and it's called SURE. This was developed during the crisis at the EU as an emergency program, and it wants to ensure that workers receive an income and that businesses retain their staff. It supports short-time work schemes to help member states protect jobs and avoid dismissal and loss of income. So what firms can do is they can temporarily reduce employee hours or suspend work altogether, with income support being provided by the state for the hours not worked. This is very important for all those people with intellectual disabilities that were in employment that had to stop working due to the pandemic, so they can keep their income and they can keep their work. Then I would like to highlight from the multi-annual financial framework, the European Social Fund Plus, as I say, wants to increase social inclusion, improve skills and jobs, but it's important to note that this is in the transition to a green and digital economy. Knowing that there is a digital gap nowadays, the fewer people with intellectual disabilities have access to the
And as Rita mentioned, a digital gap, even though in a different sense, she's gone again, finding herself in some sort of a digital gap, preventing her from entering and contributing to this webinar. So let's hope she'll be back soon again.
Milan, I think the problem is also that she doesn't know she's out.
Okay, I'm back now.
Okay.
Yes, she's back from
I'm
the.
very sorry.
Rita is
I'm
back
very
from
sorry.
the digital gap. You can.
Here in the rural world, internet is really bad. I'm sorry. So did you hear a list about the digital gap? Very pertinently.
Yes.
Okay, we'll start from there. So I would like to. I'm not sharing my screen, I guess.
Yes, you are. Just go on, please, and then finish.
Yeah, I'm very
the
sorry.
presentation.
I'm very sorry. So now other initiatives I'd like to highlight because they target the young population are the Youth Employment Initiative, supporting young people who are not studying, employed or following training, and the Youth Employment Support, which will reinforce the pre-existing Youth Guarantee, supporting vocational education and training and young entrepreneurs. So what I would like to say about all of these funds is that we need to take into account that previously it was necessary for countries to use it to implement the CRPD when using them. It is not anymore. They wanted to give more flexible conditions so countries could use them easier and quicker. So this condition disappeared. We think it's important that we should remind countries that even if it's not a condition, they're still state parties to the convention, so they need to implement the CRPD and make all their funds accessible and inclusive. And also, these funds do not work in a vacuum, so it's very important that policies at the national and European level support inclusive and accessible employment, so everybody has access to a decent job with equal pay. So thank you, and I hope you got most of my presentation.
Thank you, Rita. Yeah, I think we got it. We also have a request for people to read it because they found it interesting. So we'll definitely share it. Don't worry, we'll be sharing all the materials after the presentation, after the webinar, so everything will be available for you to dig in again and look at it into a detail. Rita outlined, let's say, the main impacts and aspects of how COVID impacted and how the EU is responding at this point. And I'm not giving up on my ambition to bring some participants into this webinar before it was put on the agenda officially. So I need you to help me in that respect. And if anybody has any question or comments on what was already said, I'd be very happy to have you. And I am saved by Sarah, so I can definitely ruin the officially prepared agenda. Sarah, thank you, and take the floor.
There you go. Hi everyone. So my name is Sarah. I just wanted to say I'm really enjoying this webinar. I found all the presentations really interesting. I've done a bit of work myself with Inclusion Europe, so I know just how good they are. And also just to put in, I am one of 6 people who will be a disabled people's employment champion with the Welsh Government. So that's a new job I'm going into, hopefully in the new year. So I wanted to share that with you all as well. So, in that job, I'll be working with business leaders of small and medium-sized businesses and inspiring them to employ more people with intellectual disabilities.
Well, that's a very good news. Thank you, Sarah. Be very happy to have you back on to contribute to our work once you are in that job and share your experience with them.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's probably a good time for me to plug in that the next year for Inclusion Europe, we will dedicate the whole year to employment, and we'll be bringing more examples and perspectives on how this works. So I think, of course, we'll be looking at different things, but Sarah will definitely be interested to hear more about your work after you settle in a bit, and you'll have things to share. Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to come in? If that's not the case, we'll move to the next speaker, and that is my colleague Helen Porto from Inclusion Europe, and she will have the not so easy task on bringing together all the recommendations and conclusions from the 2 years of work that we had on this project, and giving you an idea of the recommendations that we have for employers, for governments, and for others involved in shaping the labor market and ensuring people with intellectual disabilities can also access the jobs in an open labor market. So that's Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milan. Yes, so for the recommendations from this project and also from the latest developments after the COVID pandemic and the report that was done with the Plena Inclusion, here are some of the recommendations. So first of all, for the next European disability strategy that is currently being drafted, the project establishes the need to guarantee reasonable accommodation, aiming to creating job opportunities, and also those job opportunities should be in the European institutions to ensure that people with intellectual disabilities are included in employment support and recovery plans. To do so, it's important that people with intellectual disabilities and their representatives are consulted when it comes to drafting those plans. And to do so, also to draft those policies, reliable data should be collected, so accurate data disaggregated by type of disability, gender, and so on, which should also include people in institutions and people with complex support needs. So this is for the drafting of policies and the next EU disability strategy. Then on the working conditions of people with disability, it's also important in the future to recognize the work people do when they work in sheltered workshops, to make sure that they can benefit from the measures taken to protect workers. So this is exactly as mentioned previously. During the pandemic, some workers could not benefit from measures granted during the pandemic, and so this is why it's important, amongst others. And then also ending segregation is definitely a key goal to ensure the transition from sheltered workshops and settings to the open labor market through deinstitutionalization and by including people with intellectual disabilities in lifelong learning and vocational training programs. And speaking of education and lifelong learning programs, it's important to give people with intellectual disabilities the skills to find employment So this is why providing accessible training to people with intellectual disabilities on skills helpful to find employment is key, but also on skills like writing a CV or being successful in interviews. And this is, as was explained by Barbara, during this project, this can be done through job coaching, for instance. What's also important, and we experienced it with the previous speaker, is to address the digital gap, because as the EU strives to achieve a digital economy, making technology accessible for people with intellectual disability is also very important, as it's also becoming more and more important in our daily lives and jobs. So this is why accessible trainings to allow people with intellectual disability to use the necessary technology tools to work at home and make subsidies available to buy those technology is also something key for the future. Then on the employer side, what's important is to provide training to employers on employing people with intellectual disability and their obligation in this regard, particularly the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation, which is still in some cases not so well known. Then also, once they have been provided with the training, it's important to help employers to find workers with intellectual disabilities. And this can be done through creating networks of inclusive companies and entrepreneurs and partnerships between schools and industries. Then it's also important to make the hiring and recruitment accessible, to make sure that the process does not prevent people with intellectual disabilities from applying, and then that the recruitment process and it's accessible, and there's no assessment that's inaccessible for people with disability. That's it is adapted. So for instance, with documents and easy to read. And also an important aspect is the financial incentive. So for instance, making it easier and sustainable to gain financial support for the employers. And then definitely on finances, what's important, but this time on the side of the person who's being employed, person with disability, is to make sure that people with intellectual disability, once they get into employment in the open labor market, they do not lose their disability benefits, the disability benefits they had before. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So these are some of the issues that we should focus on in the future, but also issues that have not been tackled so much in this project because it was only a 3-year project, and we need to watch out for in the future. And this is everyone. It's the particular situation of women with intellectual disabilities, which have even lower employment rates than men. So this is an aspect that should be properly addressed in the future. And so this also goes hand in hand with the question of intersectionality and discrimination. So intersectionality is basically when you are being discriminated against because you're part of multiple groups that tend to be discriminated against. So for instance, women and people with intellectual disabilities, so women with intellectual disabilities. And then one other important aspect is the question of the mutual recognition of disability across Europe, because it's something when you move from one country to another country, when you have a disability, you can lose some of your social benefits, disabilities being categorized differently. And so this impedes movement of workers in Europe. And this also applies to people with intellectual disability, and applies actually even more because you can lose your disability entitlements when you go to another country. So this is something also very important to look out for in the future. I hope I made this clear. And yes, as Milan will probably say, now it's time for questions or remark, if you have any.
Well, Milan doesn't have to say that because you did. Thank you, Ellen. And yes, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to raise your hand or write them in the chat. Well, looks like you are giving me no option but to go into the last bit of our webinar, which to me allows something. Yes, of course, we will, as I said, we'll be sharing all the presentations and reports mentioned during the webinar. So you will have all that available for you to look into in more detail. And now for a special entertainment part that was prepared, I guess, by my colleagues to torture me, we would like to invite you to do a little bit of contribution in writing. We will share in the chat a link to a web page on which you can click, and then it will ask you to write in a couple of words. And those words are about what you would like to see improved when it comes to employment. And we'll use those words to create a word cloud and see which words are most often used. I don't know. I don't see the link being shared. Now it's there. So please head into the chat, click on the link, and type in your answer to the question, what would you want to improve? What you would like to see that improves when it comes to employment? So we'll give you some time to do that. And after it, we should be able to see a collection of the words that you contributed. So please add to the link in the chat and click on that and fill in whatever your ideas for better inclusive employment are. Okay, looks like some of you have already done that, and the words are starting to appear on the screen. You can, if you haven't done so yet, go to the link provided in the chat and fill in your answer. If you have already done it, you can go back to watching the screen like I do and observe the interesting movement that the words create there, and try to figure out which one appears most frequently. And I think that you are all very creative and we don't have any words that would actually repeat. Oh, one. Finally, something for me to read. I say finally because my other task here is then to read out loud the most frequent options. So I need to have some of them to be most frequent. Still some contributions coming in, so we'll give it a little bit more time, and then we will have a look at what the result of this is, what you contributed. Okay, thank you everyone. As you can probably see on your screens, there we have a colorful selection of the words that you contributed, and some more are still arriving, but I will try to read at least some of those bigger ones. And if I'm not mistaken, the biggest word there, so most repeated by you, is support. Then we have reasonable accommodation, equal salaries. We also have empathy appearing quite strongly, and then many other important elements to employment. So thank you very much to everybody who contributed. I think the message of equal salaries, support, and reasonable accommodation that formed itself at the heart of this picture sums up nicely what this is about. And we'll also have a look at the other things that you contributed once we can see them properly. So thank you everyone very much. Your last opportunity, if you want to come in with any comments or questions before we head to a conclusion of this webinar. Well, I would like to thank all the speakers for your contributions. Thank you very much. We will, as I said, share all the presentations and reports afterwards, so you can have a look at them in detail. I will again remind you that also if you go to Inclusion Europe website, you will find the videos that were created about employment, and I think they are available in many different languages, so you can also have a look how that might be useful for you in your respective countries. And the last thing to mention, and already talked about it too, is that this may be our last webinar in this series and in this project, but it's definitely not our last word on employment. The whole 2021 Inclusion Europe will be looking at employment and highlighting different practices and examples and businesses that employ people with intellectual disabilities, and doing further research on that issue. So I think this is not the last time we hear and see each other. One of the things to potentially already put on your calendars is the week from 7th of June, when we will have our Europe in Action conference. It will be online for obvious reasons, so you don't have to travel anywhere, but we will take you to different parts of Europe, looking on different sorts of employment and how that works. So the week of 7th of June next year, mark it in your calendars. Don't plan any holidays or anything else. Be ready to learn a lot more about employment for people with intellectual disability. And with that, thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much to everyone who contributed to this webinar, for your time. And I guess, given the time of the year, I wish you a Merry Christmas and a happy, hopefully COVID-less New Year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigado. Adeus. Thank you.